everybody. This is Joanna Schaffner-Scott, and you are listening to the Race in the Workplace podcast, a show for DEI organizational leaders that explores race, racism, and racial equity in the workplace. I am a racial equity consultant and founder of the Stamey Street Consulting Group, a consulting firm that specializes in partnering with organizations to help them meet their racial equity aspirations. My goal for you is to move your organization from being colorblind to equity-centered through sustainable, step-by-step changes. Hi, it's Joanna Schaffner-Scott. Thank you for allowing me to join you in your day, no matter when you're listening. This episode of the podcast is taken straight from my blog, also called Race in the Workplace. It's the audio version of an article that I wrote in 2018 and recently updated. The article is called Nonprofit Execs, Are You Constantly Losing Staff of Color? Here are the 4 ways to stop the churn. I wrote this article because I was finding that so many nonprofits start their racial equity journey from a diversity perspective by hiring Black staff and staff of color without doing the necessary systems work to support and retain the talent they hire. If you are listening and you see your organization in the perspectives that I'm sharing, I encourage you to take a closer look at the 4 steps that I outline and rethink not only your processes, but the order of them. All right, let's get into it. Has your nonprofit experienced a churning of Black staff? By churn, I mean you have hired smart, capable people. Enthusiastically, they onboard, stay for a while, but usually leave within 2 years. Then your hiring process starts over again and ends the same way. Am I describing your last few hires? If so, it may be time to pause hiring. Instead, look hard at your systems, organizational culture, and how you work. A recent article noted that Black women are more likely to feel uncomfortable bringing their whole selves to work. 42% feel uncomfortable sharing their thoughts about racial equity, and 22% feel like they can't talk about the impact current events are having on them or in their community. Naming without action. If anything, the intense focus on racism from 2020 enabled more nonprofits to name racism and bias fluently, but many have not taken the additional steps to internalize change behaviors through better practices. For example, moving beyond naming means showing up differently at work and in the world. If your organization has declared itself to be anti-racist, it should look, feel, and most importantly, function differently because of shifts in culture, behavior, and practices. There's a difference between intellectualizing racial equity and doing the work of behavior change. Sustainability through a systems approach. I am a big fan of the book Atomic Habits by James Clear. Seriously, that book changed my life in so many ways. 2 of my favorite lines in this book are, "You do not rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems, and your behaviors are a reflection of your identity." So clear, right? Pun intended. These 2 sentences indicate the need for systems to support desired outcomes. Let's use my favorite lines to dig into the reasons for churn among Black nonprofit staff. Nonprofit execs, my starting questions are, how are Black staff faring within your organization? And how does that faring reflect your organizational identity? In my experience, root causes for churn include a lack of inclusion, a lack of access to power, no upward trajectory for promotion, an oppressive, toxic work environment, continually naming racism without policy or practice change, feeling invisible or feeling hypervisible, either ignored or tokenized, especially when white-led nonprofits take on diversity, equity, and inclusion and attempt to lead, and a disconnect between the organization's public identity and internal practice. Might some of these dynamics be at play within your organization? If so, here are some concrete steps nonprofits can take to retain Black staff and staff of color. Number 1, Acknowledge that your workplace environment could be toxic for Black people. Often in the racial equity space, we split structures from people, yet people create systems and implement policies and practices. If not disrupted, white supremacy lives in the structures of your organizations. That means to disrupt it, you must first acknowledge it. However, acknowledging alone is not sufficient. It is critical for nonprofit leaders to understand that someone on staff benefits from the toxicity, and that benefit can accumulate across racial lines. Serious conversations about organizational identity that name and disrupt racism can create fear for those who benefit from it. These feelings are real and stem from the threat of losing privilege and power. Number 2, accept that your staff have different experiences by position and racial identity. Understanding is not enough. Notice I said accept. Acceptance is absolutely critical, in my opinion. In my experience, this reality can be hard for nonprofit executives to accept. Yet, it is true. So many organizational processes are wrapped in an equality framework, i.e., everyone is treated the same, therefore their experience is the same. However, once you accept that this belief is untrue, shifting practices becomes much easier. My firm, Stamey Street, can help you figure this out, but I caution you, do not go down this path, leaders, unless you are prepared to hear hard truths, possibly about your own leadership style, and unless you plan to make a change. Number 3, accept that some managers will never be okay with equity-centered processes. If that's the case, that's probably a major reason Black staff leave your organization. Such attitudes signal an inclusion problem at the heart of the churn. Shifting toward equity will require a mix of shifting staff competencies and maybe some staffing changes. Again, this particular shift connects back to your organizational identity. Are you who you say you are? Lastly, number 4, be accountable. Decide that creating trauma and harm is unacceptable. Shift toward equity by adjusting your policies, practices, and protocols to protect Black staff and staff of color across identities. With time and intentionality, you can change who you are as an organization. Do this important work before starting your next recruiting process. Until next time, take the best of care. That's this week's episode of Race in the Workplace. Don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast and share it with a friend who may be a DEI professional who can use these strategies in their work. My hope for the podcast is that it reaches every person who needs it. Until next time, take care.